So one of the interesting things about the Switch 2 life cycle has been people making these wild claims about how the console is failing and how it's not going to succeed and how Nintendo doesn't have a handheld anymore or a console. That's been one of the interesting copes, going into this is that a lot of argument that Nintendo Switch is completely alone, that Nintendo no longer has handhelds to fall back on. And as a result, eventually Nintendo Switch is going to implode, and then Nintendo's going to go out of business and then go third party, and then they'll fail. Like, never mind the fact that is not and never has been true. So, if you look back on the history of the Switch 1, what you have is a console that launches that coincides with the 3DS. So the 3DS is still continuing even after the Switch initially launched. And it continued getting new games and support until like 2020 or so, which coincidentally is around the point that Switch reached its absolute high point, like with Animal Crossing New Horizons. So but then, the 3DS faded away, and now the Switch is all by itself, and now Nintendo has nothing to fall back on. This is completely misrepresenting what's actually happening. That now the Switch is coinciding with the Switch 2. So what this means is the Switch 1 is still being supported. People are still using it. It has features that tie into Switch 2s. They've released like patents about it. They haven't explicitly said it, but the Switch 1 is going to stick around for a long, long time after the Switch 2 launch. The Switch 2 was not the kind of product that you go out and buy right away because most of the games for it, most of the Switch 2, like most of the games coming out in the near future are indeed also launching on Switch 1. Pokemon ZA, Metroid Prime 4, Tamagotchi Life, Rhythm Heaven, all are confirmed for Switch 1 releases. Now, there's a handful of confirmed Switch 2 exclusives, but for the most part, a lot of games are launching on both platforms with an easy-to-understand upgrade system to take advantage of the Switch 2's more powerful hardware. So what this means is that for a lot of people, there is no need necessarily to upgrade to Switch 2. And the narrative is that this is a bad thing, that this is a huge deal that will sabotage Switch 2 sales. But in actuality, what Nintendo has done has kind of introduced an incremental upgrade to Nintendo Switch with the Switch 2 that runs the same games better, that has more features, more abilities, more technological advancements. Like it is essentially like kind of a Game Boy Color or a new 3DS style upgrade. It isn't truly a next generation platform. It's just something that they put out to run all the big third party games. And that's something about Switch 2 that I think a lot of people don't understand is that like we are basically getting every major Switch third-party game on this thing right away. Like any company that ignores this console is, by and large, going to put themselves in a bad position. And what's more, in theory, Nintendo could put out a new Switch 3 at any time. They could do that. They could put out a new console. Like again, like they have essentially introduced a format in which they can continue supporting the Switch indefinitely, right? Like it might be a very Switch 1 very well may not be retired for a very, very, very long time. I remember back in 2017, Nintendo released a claim that they intended to support it for far longer than most other platforms. And at the time, I expected around 2027 when this thing would finally be retired. But the way things are looking now, it looks as if it's going to extend far beyond that. Nintendo intends to keep Switch 1 relevant far into like the next decade. And that's kind of shocking to think about. But when you think about what happens when, people tend to upgrade to Switch 2s, when they tend to give Switch 1s to younger people who can play like, older games or games that like or indie like smaller releases, like it's kind of interesting to see like Nintendo seems to have taken advantage of the unique culture around their hardware in which it does tend to stick around for a while people do tend to stick with these consoles and these games for a long period of time. And now they have reached the point where they've established a method of keeping their games and hardware relevant in perpetuity, because you don't need to rebuy digital games again on Switch 2. You don't need to keep your old hardware around. You can pass it on to other people, and you can just kind of, enjoy your new hardware. Like, I think that Nintendo has kind of adopted a kind of like Apple iOS style, like, system where they can just introduce new incrementally powerful hardware, have like hardcore fans update, but casual fans can just stick with the older stuff and have absolutely no issue playing most of the games that come out. And that is, I think, probably a pretty solid method of keeping multiple pieces of hardware on the market, keeping multiple people engaged, not having to shut down the Switch One eShop or anything like that. Like, this is like going to keep the Switch One relevant for a long time. And as a result of that, the PlayStation brand is not just competing with the Switch 2, it's also competing with the Switch 1. Like the 150 million, the best-selling console ever, the Nintendo Switch is still going to be relevant going into this generation. When the PS6 comes out, the PS5 will be completely obsolete, but with the Switch, you are going to see more people own multiple Switches in their homes because of what Nintendo has done with this specific console. And the odd thing about this is that it seems like nobody else seems to have realized what's happened. People don't seem to realize that the Switch 1 has not been replaced, that it's still very much relevant, that people are still using it, playing games on it, buying games for it. And as such, the entire core cope around Switch 2, this idea that nobody's buying it, has completely and utterly imploded, because even if that was true, people already bought the Switch 1. So over time, people would eventually upgrade to the next console. So, like, again, it's very interesting to kind of see this play out, because this has been one of the major copes in regards to like hardcore gamers for the past couple of years. The idea that Nintendo no longer has their dedicated gaming handhelds to fall back on, that they were completely reliant on the Switch 1 and the next console could ruin them, and it just didn't happen. It's very interesting to kind of see the end result of this coping and seething. And yeah, we are, I think, on the verge of, people who've been hating Nintendo since the 80s, Ultima fanboys, NES boomers, PlayStation fans. Like, all these guys are just about to get completely and totally fucked, because we're at the point where Nintendo doesn't really have any competition at all. And all they can do is just kind of sit there and, like, pray to Grand Theft Auto 6 that will, like, ruin Nintendo somehow, even though that's also coming out on Switch 2. Like, there's just nothing they can do at this point. There is absolutely nothing that anyone can do to downplay the enduring success and legacy of Nintendo Switch.